Castile was in a prime position to unite with either of their major neighbors towards the latter half of the 1400s. This was for a simple reason. King Henry IV didn't have a male heir, only a daughter, Joanna. She would, eventually, be married to King Afonso of Portugal, thereby creating the possibility for a Castilian-Portuguese union. But there was another pretender, Isabella, the half-sister of Henry IV, who was herself married to Ferdinand of Aragon, thereby creating the potential for a Castilian-Aragonese union. These two women would form the foundation of a civil war in Castile, and the victor would decide the fate of the Iberian Peninsula. Now, in principle, Joanna, as the direct child of King Henry, should have been very secure in her succession. But rumors were spread that she was a bastard, that her real father was not the king, but instead a nobleman, Beltran de la Cueva. Her reputation came under attack while she was only 2 years old, and her opponents began calling her Joanna la Beltraneja, a reference to her alleged real father. It is, as far as I am aware, unclear whether this rumor was actually real, or only invented in an attempt to weaken Henry's rule. Regardless, the nobles used it to put pressure on Henry, forcing him to remove his own daughter from succession, instead naming his half-brother Afonso as heir. A year later, a civil war broke out as the nobles attempted to install this Afonso to power prematurely. But Henry would achieve victory when Afonso died at 14, ending the revolt. Still, it was clear that Henry's reign was weak, and compromise was needed. A treaty was signed between Henry IV and his opponents. His rule was reaffirmed, but he had to officially annul his marriage to his wife, removing Joanna from succession again. Isabella was now to become the heir presumptive, but only on the condition she couldn't marry without Henry's permission. Isabella would ignore this, and married Ferdinand of Aragon in secret, and when Henry found out, he once again switched to Joanna as his heir. The stage was now set for the Castilian War of Succession. Once Henry died, this war broke out, and considering that Isabella not only had the support of the most powerful internal nobles, but also the foreign support of Aragon, Joanna's supporters desperately sought foreign support as well. Considering she was a pretender to an entire kingdom, her hand in marriage was very valuable. But to be clear, she was by this point only 13. She barely had a personal role in decision making and was simply a pawn of the nobles and foreign powers. Now, she had almost married a French prince, which might have pulled Castile closer into the French orbit, but France would back out, partially out of fears that Joanna might be illegitimate. Instead, right before the war began, she was betrothed to Afonso of Portugal, and the entire peninsula got ready for conflict, while France, weary of Aragon's expansionism, considered backing Joanna. The war also went beyond Europe itself, as Portugal had by this point an early head start in colonization and held a practical monopoly on trade with West Africa. So, Isabella hoped that through a victory here, she could open up the region to Castilian traders as well. Now, as you'll likely know, it would be Isabella that would win this war, unifying the crowns of Castile and Aragon, setting the foundation for the Spain we know today. Her victory can in large part be blamed on Afonso's inaction and his unwillingness to act decisively. As Isabella rushed to secure Castile, Portugal already started the war on the back foot, focusing on consolidating some border territories rather than taking the fight to Isabella. He abandoned a plan to march to the northern city of Burgos, from where he may have linked up with French forces and sought a decisive victory to the war. Instead, the two sides fought some undecisive battles along the frontier, culminating in the Battle of Toro. This wasn't a huge victory for Isabella and Ferdinand, but across Castile they declared that it was. This helped internal support for Joanna dry up. France lost interest in supporting her, and the Portuguese forces returned to Portugal. This basically secured Isabella's victory, though the war on the seas would continue for a while longer, eventually leading to a Portuguese victory. In exchange for Afonso dropping his claims to Castile and annulling his marriage to Joanna, the Castilians would recognize Portuguese hegemony in the southern Atlantic. With that conflict over, Castile and Aragon became united in a personal union. Shortly after, through marriage, inheriting Burgundy, the Austrian lands, and gaining the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor, unifying it all in the figure of Charles V. Yet, all of this could have very easily not happened. Medieval alternate histories are very fickle, especially in terms of single wars and battles deciding the fate of entire kingdoms. While I do think Isabella and Ferdinand were the favorites to win this war, bolder action from Portugal, actual French support, and perhaps a couple important nobles switching sides would make it far from unreasonable to suggest Joanna and her husband could have won. And perhaps instead, Portugal and Castile would be united in personal union. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But allow me to immediately spoil the fun and say that this is far from guaranteed to create a long-term Portuguese-Castilian union. Historically, Joanna and Afonso never got a kid. And again, Joanna was still very young when she was betrothed to Afonso. Afonso also died in 1481, while Joanna was only 19. While it is not unthinkable the two might get a child in this period, it is far from guaranteed either. Quite possibly, once Afonso dies, Joanna simply continues ruling in Castile, while John II, a son of Afonso from a previous marriage, rules Portugal. It might even be possible that Isabella and Ferdinand just try another war now that Castile is isolated again. In that case, we may transpose into something closer to our timeline anyways. Alternatively, Joanna may simply finish her reign, potentially remarrying at some point, and thereby ensuring the three traditional kingdoms on the peninsula survive into the early modern era. And obviously, even just removing Spain can have immense effects on Europe going forwards. Now, if you do want Portugal and Castile to remain united, which I will explore towards the end of this video too, we have a couple of options, but they aren't necessarily easy. One option would be Joanna convincing Castilian nobles to empower John II as King of Castile after Afonso's death, with Joanna and John as co-monarchs. Still, this would make John's claim very weak, inviting Isabella to potentially strike back, while inviting questions as to John's family's claim to power once Joanna dies, especially if Joanna does get other children. Going with such a route seems guaranteed to cause succession struggles in the future. Another option could be to have Joanna and Afonso get a kid before Afonso dies. This would still lead to John II gaining Portugal, while Joanna remains in Castile. But John historically only had one child, who also died before him, meaning that, after John's death, his half-brother may become King of Portugal, and after Joanna's death, King of Castile too. Once more, this is a quite complicated route, which may fall apart due to infighting in either nation. But it would be the option that leads to the most stable Portugal-Castilian union. Now in this video, we will start by covering the timeline where Spain doesn't exist, and the three Iberian crowns remain separate. There, we will basically discuss how this might affect colonization, the Holy Roman Empire, and European geopolitics at large. Afterwards, we will conclude by adding a unified Portugal-Castile into this alternate Europe we have discussed, and how they yet further may affect colonization, trade, and geopolitics. The third option that exists, wherein Isabella conquers Castile but later, we will not discuss, as that will mostly result in a timeline similar to ours. So let's dive into the no Spain timeline, where first of all, I want to explore the effects that this may have on exploration. Specifically, The relation between Portugal and Castile is very important, as are Castilian rights to trade in West Africa. Historically, because Castile couldn't go south due to Portugal's monopoly, Isabella and Ferdinand were interested in employing Columbus, which would give Spain the head start in the Americas. So in this timeline, it depends on if the temporary personal union and alliance between Castile and Portugal changes this fact, and if Queen Joanna is even interested in exploration at all. This leads to two broad potentials. In one, Castile may still arrive in the Americas early, and may still become the dominant power there. In the other, Columbus is ignored by Joanna, and Castile remains a more traditional power. The Americas would still get discovered, plausibly by the Portuguese from Brazil, but this means that the early conquest of the Aztecs and the Inca may never happen, and colonization on the whole could be slower, while the native civilizations may have more time to adapt to the diseases before the Europeans come to truly conquer. That would leave Aragon to actually be the most important kingmaker in this alternate timeline. Isabella and Ferdinand are one of the most well-known power couples in history, absolute titans at playing the marriage game, and they were key in the creation of Charles V's massive empire. The family tree is complicated, but to oversimplify a bit, Isabella and Ferdinand had Castile and Aragon, so their daughter Joanna would inherit it all as Spain. On the other side, Maximilian of Austria married Mary of Burgundy. When Mary died, their son Philip inherited Burgundy. Philip then married Joanna the Mad, and they got a child named Charles. When Philip died, Charles got Burgundy, co-ruling with his mother in Spain, while later inheriting Austria from his grandfather, completing his domains. Now in this alternate timeline, for a variety of reasons, this may all never happen. Perhaps Isabella and Ferdinand simply have different priorities. Perhaps the Habsburgs seek a different partner for Philip the Handsome, or perhaps the genetic lottery may just play out a bit differently due to circumstance, and Joanna the Mad is a female. She also had an older brother, John, who may still survive, meaning she would never inherit Spain anyways. As always in medieval alternate histories, these single marriages can move continents. But if we assume that, broadly, the marriages, deaths and genetics play out similarly, we could have an alternate timeline where Aragon is still married into the Habsburg family, and the alternate empire of Charles V may look something like this. Centered a lot more on the Mediterranean and the Holy Roman Empire, without the colonial empire to worry about. Now if this does occur, we enter a rather interesting timeline, which may even be quite beneficial for both Castile and Aragon. Or it could end in an early demise for the Habsburgs. For Castile, even if they do not get the massive historical head start in the Americas, they are regardless in one of the best positions to start colonizing, as Portugal is far more interested in Africa and Asia, and France and England aren't yet interested in colonial ventures. But unlike our timeline, where the colonial empire became little more than a source of gold, which Charles could use to pursue his European ambitions, this alternate Castile can focus completely on this colonial empire. They don't have to worry about the Reformation in Germany, fighting an 80 years long war against the Dutch, trying to invade or conquer England, and even the rise of the Ottomans is far less of a Castilian concern without their influence in Italy. Yet, concretely, what Castile does with this is difficult to say. Completing the Reconquista at some point is likely, but then what? They may come to oppose Aragon, potentially, even if temporarily, allying with France against them. Though they are also likely to at any point switch sides to the Habsburgs if France threatens to become too powerful. Alternatively, with their bigger colonial focus, they may care a lot more to pursue competition with Portugal, trying to remove their smaller neighbor from their Asian trading routes, while playing a smaller role in overall European geopolitics. In the absolute best case, if Castile plays their cards right, they may come to play a role similar to the Dutch in real history. The Dutch were a great power, mostly due to their trading prowess and wealth. Yet compared to the other great powers like France, who had a very traditional idea of increasing power via expansion, the Dutch didn't really care too much about territory, focusing instead on wealth. Depending on what Castile focus on, they may adopt a similar policy. Their potential would be immense due to the American gold mines, allowing them to employ mercenary companies to fight or subsidize any side of a conflict they may want to win. Such a Castile may not seek massive territorial expansion, but simply tries to ensure that no Western European power becomes too powerful. Of course, this all depends on how they handle their financials. Historically, hyperinflation due to gold and silver flooding in from the colonies, combined with all the foreign adventures and wars, ruined the Spanish treasury and economy. If this still happens, then this alternate Castilian state will be in quite a lot of trouble, and they will struggle to maintain their colonial empire once other threats begin to present themselves. Now, as for the Habsburg Empire, including Aragon, this timeline could likewise either make them more powerful or may ensure they struggle far more in competing with France. In terms of the positive angle, historically, Spain practically had a cheat code due to their massive colonial empire. They had so much gold, allowing for so many soldiers, so many ships, and so many bribes and wars, that they basically never had to compete on equal footing with the other great powers. The fundamental issues with a stagnant economy, corruption and inflation were never properly tackled, and Spain was soon eclipsed by, on paper, weaker powers, which utilized their strength more efficiently. Without the money of the Americas, Aragon-Austria may just need to be a more traditional great power, and this may lead to more responsible government. While they may not be as dominant in this era as Spain historically was, it is possible that they are more stable, and they don't have the massive fall from dominance that Spain also experienced. Of course, the flip side of this is that without American gold, the wars of the era against France and the Ottomans may become far more difficult, which, in the worst case, could lead to disasters if the Habsburgs don't secure alliances to counterbalance. Now crucially, historically, Charles divided his realm up after his death. His son Philip gained Spain, Italy, the Lowlands, and the colonial empire, while Charles's brother Ferdinand got Austria and the Holy Roman Emperorship. In the mind of us map painters, this may seem strange. Why would you voluntarily make your empire smaller? But it is important to realize that Charles's empire was literally unprecedented. While we have seen plenty of huge empires in history, even within Europe, no empire had been this big and this disconnected. For one man to effectively govern it all, it was a drag. He relied heavily on family members to govern various regions, and barely directly intervened in the colonial empire at all. His brother Ferdinand had as early as 1521 gained the Archduchy of Austria to rule in name of his brother, and was king of Bohemia and Hungary independently of Charles. Ferdinand also practically acted as the Holy Roman Emperor, as Charles focused way more on the Spanish parts of his realm. The full separation upon his abdication was more so a confirmation of a situation that was already practically true. So that is the main reason why his empire was divided. Charles was just way overstretched. Spain was going bankrupt through a combination of inflation because of the influx of gold and silver, and the fact that much of his money was spent on massive wars, chiefly against France and the Ottomans. Charles was also growing ill and felt he couldn't manage these issues anymore. Even worse was the Protestant Reformation, which chiefly affected the Holy Roman Empire. With Ferdinand already managing German affairs, it just made sense to let him fully take on the reins, and ensure the emperor could focus on tackling German issues. So, back to our alternate timeline. What happens there? Do Aragon and Austria likewise split after Charles? Well, it is possible, but not guaranteed. His empire is still impressive, but not that crazy, missing out on Castile and most importantly, the colonial realms. As a result, the focus of his realm is far more likely to be Germany rather than Spain, as it is unlikely that Charles needs to focus all too much on Aragon specifically. Crucially, Charles was also not a Spaniard himself, speaking Dutch and French natively, but his son Philip was very much raised as a Spaniard since birth, and unlike Charles, who had travelled all over his empire during his reign, Philip preferred to stick to Spain specifically. It is very well possible that now, Philip could be raised more in the lowlands or Germany, perhaps learning Dutch like his father, or focusing more on German. This may perhaps demote Ferdinand's importance to Charles's reign, and allow the entire empire to stay together under Philip. One side note are the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary. Even if Philip gained Austria too, those territories chose Ferdinand as king separately, which may create a Habsburg-aligned ally there. Of course, a full division does remain possible, but the odds of it not happening are at least greater. Either way, in terms of European geopolitics, France and the Ottomans stand to benefit a lot if they are lucky. Most notably, let us think about the Italian Wars, in which Spain and France fought over numerous territories in Italy, which in our timeline were mostly won by the Spanish. It is very well possible that Charles V, without as much wealth behind him, fully or partially loses these wars, which could lead to a rather scary France. Yet, as mentioned, powers like England and Castile may very well intervene to ensure the worst outcomes are prevented. But France ending up with Milan or Naples, for example, is quite plausible. From here, concrete predictions get more difficult, and a lot depends on Philip II. Does he inherit the entire empire? Does he get raised as a German? Does he think differently about Protestants than historically? And is he as dogmatically Catholic? Historically, he married Mary I of England, thereby binding England to the Habsburgs in a personal union. Does this still happen, or does he choose a different wife? The Dutch Revolt is another major plot point we can wonder about. If Philip is still as staunch against the Protestants and tramples on Dutch autonomy, then the Dutch Revolt very possibly still happens. Yet, with less money from the colonies, the Habsburgs may be forced to concede sooner, not being able to fight it out for 80 years. Perhaps more interestingly though, is that the Dutch Revolt may indeed be avoided. This could have massive effects on the world, removing the Dutch as a trading power, thereby further empowering the Spanish and Portuguese as trading powers, while later England and France too, while removing one of the fundamental powers shaping European and global geopolitics and economics. So that roughly includes the rundown on the No Spain timeline. The removal of one superpower may lead to the creation of two separate great powers. Castile as a state may focus entirely on colonial matters, their European geopolitics focused mainly on preventing either France or the Habsburgs from becoming too powerful. Aragon, meanwhile, may remain in the Habsburg orbit through marriage, and takes on the primary role of Spain on the European continent, their success to be decided on the battlefield, as the primary line of defense against the French. But will the removal of the influx of gold and silver from the Americas prevent the bankruptcy and inflation we saw historically, or may it weaken the Habsburgs to allow the French to come out on top? Will this Habsburg Empire be successful in keeping their realm unified and their governance reasonable, only amplifying their long-term success? I will leave all these questions up to you for now. So that is the broad rundown of the scenario wherein Joanna wins the Castilian War of Succession. Iberia remains divided, and we presume that the reign of Charles V still occurs. But now, what if we add to that an actual Portuguese-Castilian union? Again, coming about through some dynastic shenanigans. Quite a lot of our analysis will remain unchanged, as Portugal-Castile will of course still be a rather inwards-looking state, disconnected from much of Europe, focused on their exploration, trading and colonization. Now in this, it is important to note that despite having a shared monarch, many of the nobles and traders of the two realms would continue to operate mostly independently. I have already alluded to it before, but Charles V and his court didn't actually directly lead the colonization of the Americas. Cortés led an independent expedition to Mexico in name of the Spanish crown, and Pizarro did the same in Peru. Therefore, in this timeline, it is not necessarily the case that if Portugal was in charge, the Castilian conquistadors no longer care about the Americas, but instead get into the spice trade of Asia as well. Conversely, if we assume it is a Castilian-dominated union, it is not like Portuguese trading ships would be forced to stop all of their voyages to the east. As such, Castile-Portugal would have the potential to become quite the superpower, if we assume that the Castilians still get involved in going west and conquer the Americas. Again, this already brings in unprecedented wealth through gold and silver mines, but simultaneously, the Portuguese half of the kingdom is first to reach Asia, centuries before the British and the French start competing, and the Dutch don't even exist yet. Of course, the option of hyperinflation does remain, yet once more, the odds of this have been reduced through a more low-key geopolitical situation, as well as a more diversified economy overall. Once more, a comparison with the Dutch comes to mind, and honestly, it is very possible that this power becomes too rich or too powerful. Aragon is always likely to be an enemy of Castile-Portugal, but there are also the French and later the English or even the Danes who may find themselves envious of the success of the nation. After all, this is a union which is threatening to consolidate all of South America, most of North America, much of the African coastline from Morocco to South Africa, and much of Asia's trade. The diplomatic situation for this nation will be incredibly difficult to manage. So long as France remains the biggest threat to the other great powers, Castile-Portugal may be fine, potentially even joining the fight against the French. But at any point, much like how the French orchestrated an anti-Dutch coalition, the Castilians might find themselves on the losing end of such a conflict, and either get knocked down a peg, if not, facing an even broader partition. Yet if, hiding under the shadow of France's continual rise, the nation avoids such a fate, this power may be truly terrifying. But of course, an overheated economy leading to a collapse and then stagnation, as we saw historically, also remains a very valid outcome. Regardless of what happens geopolitically, if we assume the Union remains together and doesn't break apart for whatever reason, we would see the cultures of the two states grow closer together. They wouldn't fully merge, much like how Catalonia is still a distinct identity within Spain, but we would see Castilian and Portuguese grow closer together, while Aragon is the one with completely separate cultural development. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you enjoyed the video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.